Pierre Poilievre's Housing Hell video has now been viewed 500,000 times on YouTube. In it, Poilievre claims that the housing hell in Canada began about 8 years ago, when Justin Trudeau came to power and began deficit spending. As Prime Minister, Poilievre would solve these problems with a dollar-for-dollar law mandating government-balanced budgets, by rewarding municipalities with the most housing supports that had already produced the most housing, and by transferring surplus government lands and properties over to the private sector. Now, many have already pointed out there are some bad to embarrassing flaws in Poilievre's so-called logic. Housing rates in Canada have been growing steadily for decades before the Trudeau Liberals, including when Poilievre was in the cabinet of the Harper government. The higher construction per capita rates happened in Canada's social democratic heyday, prior to the neoliberal cuts by Liberal and Conservative governments, not because of them. Funding after the fact is a strange way of solving the lack of funding for housing that has plagued the last 3 decades. And Poilievre even bizarrely claims that the Squamish people in Vancouver have been setting an example he would like to follow by constructing 6,000 units of housing, when the Squamish not only got their land back into communal ownership first, but are funding the development with $1.4 billion in loans from the Trudeau Liberals, not only contradicting his message on spending, but giving Justin Trudeau this photo op. I'm hardly a Trudeau supporter, but this doesn't hurt him at all. One moment, however, encapsulates the backwardness of Poilievre's neoliberal so-called economics. The moment he brought up Singapore. Parts of Canada are even less affordable than Singapore, Poilievre says, which is a wealthy island that has 2,000 times more people per kilometer than Canada. This is true, but why? Once again, as you shall see, Poilievre is really hoping no one begins to look it up. It is worth getting to know the political economy of Singapore, which makes for a fascinating case study. If you want the blow-by-blow, I highly recommend reading Anne Hala's classic book of political economy, Urban Land Rent, Singapore as a Property State. It traces the political economy of considering land rent as predatory unearned income to the policies of Singapore after independence. Well, Poilievre talks about Canada having lots of land. He doesn't actually talk about land value itself. Unsurprising, given that he, along with half his party's members of parliament, is a landlord. Singapore, which only gained independence a little over 60 years ago, had to think very hard about land value, having a dense population on a tiny parcel of land. There are today about 5.5 million people in Singapore on a plot of land barely bigger than the city of Toronto. So, did they hand the land and property over to private landlords? Not exactly. Using eminent domain laws, the government spent decades removing land from private ownership. Gradually, they went from having 30% public ownership of land to 90% public ownership of land. While members of the Poilievre camp like to accuse anything to the left of Attila the Hun of having something to do with communism, this literally was. The land was then and is still leased for use, with land rents going into the public purse to pay for things like quality public transit. Meanwhile, a public housing agency produced 80% of the housing units in Singapore, effectively eradicating landlords from both land and housing. Many of these units are condominium style, with 99-year leases, but because they are going through a public agency that doesn't need to turn a profit, they are sold at below the market rate. This leads to a situation that sounds strange to a North American ear, but makes sense if you don't want landlords leeching your economy. Practically all the land is held publicly. Practically nobody has private ownership of land. Almost all the housing is produced through a public housing agency, but 90% of Singapore's population are registered as homeowners. And yes, it has been surprisingly successful. Singapore has both a strong economy and hardly any homelessness in one of the most densely populated places on Earth. Public land ownership isn't the only way to stop land rents from leeching the economy. Land taxes, Henry George style, can work very effectively, and were instrumental in San Francisco rebuilding after the earthquake that leveled the city in 1906. Community land trusts place plots of land under the control of a local democratic nonprofit, and are very effective at producing not just affordable housing, but more affordable access to lots of other things that tend to get gentrified out of neighborhoods. As mayor of Burlington, Bernie Sanders produced the first municipally funded community land trust in the United States, and today it is home to 3,000 remarkably affordable housing units. All of these work very well, but none of them have anything to do with the theory or proposed policies of Pierre Poilievre. Just the opposite.